But if I haven't met you in person or met you, I'm Allison Fuller, one of the co-founders at Envision Consulting. I'll let you introduce yourselves.
I'm Suzanne Elliott. I'm also with Envision.
All right. And we have Carrie Harlow here. Here you are. Are you muted?
Here we go. Sorry, it wouldn't let me unmute myself. Hello, everybody. Carrie Harlow from the Nonprofit Sustainability Initiative. Nice to join you today.
Thanks for joining us on this Wednesday to talk a little bit about strategic restructuring. I hope that this isn't a totally new topic to a lot of you, but this is definitely a hot topic that we have gotten a lot more interest of in the last few months, especially since the pandemic kind of took hold. So we wanted to take an opportunity to really talk about what strategic restructuring looks like and to help dispel some kind of rumors and myths about it and clarify how strategic restructuring works in the nonprofit sector. So Carrie Harlow is our guest from the Nonprofit Sustainability Initiative, and they really are leaders in leading the effort moving forward for helping nonprofits be sustainable. And it's an ongoing conversation that's important to have. Not just, I think that there's a thing that we'll get out of the way really quickly, which is this isn't for organizations who are in crisis. These are very strategic moves, long-term moves that help ensure that the legacy and services being offered by your organization are there for a very long time. So this is a very positive webinar where we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like. Did you have anything you wanted to add, Carrie?
No, that sounds good. Let's get into it.
Okay, cool. So next slide, please. In today's session, we're going to discuss what is strategic restructuring. So I know that's a big word. Fortunately, we're not paid by the letter, but mergers, acquisitions, partnerships, subsidiaries, collaborative programming, shared administration. We're going to kind of go through what those structures look like. We're also going to talk about why should we consider it. I think there's, certain assumptions about why you would consider these kinds of partnerships, but there's a lot of different reasons, and we want to get a little bit into that. Let's say you get past the what and the why. How do you know if you're ready? Is this something that your organization should consider? What are the kind of underlying factors that would lead you to look into something like this? And then 4 is, how do we get started? So just start off by saying we have a lot of material to cover today. This is by no means exhaustive. We do plan on having a part 2 to get a little bit more into the nitty gritty, but we wanted to make sure that we just covered the basics here. Okay, next slide. Okay, Carrie.
Yes. So what is strategic restructuring? So I think historically, when funders and nonprofit leaders talk about sustainability, we usually are talking about organizational sustainability. And I think in today's context where organizations are facing insurmountable financial challenges in some cases, the question we're asking ourselves is if we shift that frame from organizational sustainability to mission sustainability and focus instead on how we preserve the programs and impact on the community, how does this open up the new opportunities for partnership? You'll see here, this is a nice chart that kind of outlines the full spectrum of activities. This doesn't even name all of them, but there are many models that fall within what we call strategic restructuring, or could be also called sustained collaboration. So you'll see on one end of the spectrum, mergers or acquisitions. That's maybe more traditional understanding of it. But then there's also on the other side, building a network among several organizations, more sort of hybrid models of shared service agreements, co-location, back office consolidation, fiscal sponsorship relationships. So strategic restructuring is not just M&A, it's a spectrum of outcomes. And we're not just talking about the transfer or sharing of assets, such as organizational reserves or property, but the transfer or sharing of other types of assets like the human capital of an organization, the talent, the program design, institutional knowledge. So I think that's I think the broad overview of how I would define strategic restructuring, and we'll get into a little bit more of sort of what the stages of that process are.
So Carrie gave us that broad spectrum of all that strategic restructuring can mean. So we thought it'd be helpful to just give you a few examples to make it just a little bit more real. So the examples we have up here are, let's say, some of the more common structures that we've seen. So if we start at the top of that circle, a merger, which is probably what most of us think of when we think of strategic restructuring, and it is the majority of the work that we do at Envision and that NSI sees as well. So an example of a merger that we've actually worked on recently was Ability First and FEO Solutions. And they are two organizations in Pasadena that work with individuals with developmental disabilities. And Ability First is budget-wise and staffing-wise a much larger agency, and FEO Solutions is smaller, but has some really innovative job training programs. So they merged, and it was a full integration. FEO Solutions became part of Ability First, and there's some really exciting outcomes on the horizon. So that's a classic merger. If we go around the circle, we're switching slides right now, but the next example we wanted to share is joint programming. In joint programming, one example, there are lots of great examples, but one in the LA area that probably a lot of you have heard of is the TAY Collaborative. And this is a program that works with transition age youth. So youth who are typically transitioning out of foster care or out of the juvenile justice system into adulthood. And it is, there's 17 different partners who are working on this joint program that offers career readiness training for youth. And so it's a uniform curriculum that all of these partners execute. There's uniform metrics that they're tracking, and there's a program manager across all of those partners to ensure that consistency. But the program is being executed individually by different organizations like St. Anne's, Pacific Clinics, Hillsides, Hathaway Sycamores. And there's common funders as well for that program. So that's an example of joint programming. Administrative consolidation is another example. You might hear this as back office consolidation, but it's basically when organizations want to find efficiencies, but through merging their HR, finance and accounting, operations, maybe IT. And often we see it's organizations that realize they're working with common vendors or they have a common structure. So the nature of their accounting, the nature of their IT needs are very similar, and they can get efficiencies by combining efforts. So this can be implemented either by setting up a separate management services organization that becomes essentially your back office, or sometimes if there's one agency that has all those functions and is really good at them, that one agency might become the lead agency and essentially be a vendor for the others. So one example, which isn't local, but I have read about it and find it really interesting, is in Louisville. It's called Impact V. So basically there's five agencies that came together a few years ago and have shared services, accounting, HR, operations, and they're organizations that all serve children and families. So there's a DV shelter, there's a Boys and Girls Club, there's a housing provider, a Head Start provider. So they have a similar population that they're serving, similar contracts, not all exactly the same contracts, but similar government contracts. So they've been able to get great efficiencies by setting up a management services organization for all of their back office needs. Then the last example we wanted to share, just to give you some of a flavor of all of this, is the parent subsidiary. Now, sometimes this is a variation on a merger, and it kind of, sometimes it's more outward facing, sometimes it's more inward facing. but it's basically exactly what it means. There's one organization that's the parent and another organization or multiple organizations that are an affiliate or a subsidiary under the parent. And there's a couple examples in the LA area that we thought would be good to share. So one, which probably a lot of you have heard about, was a couple years ago, Hillsides and Bienvenidos came together. And Hillsides is so they have one governing body, they have one leadership team, they've consolidated their back office operations, but the Bienvenidos is a subsidiary of Hillsides, and they've retained their name, and so their centers that are in the community are still called Bienvenidos. Because that was really important to them and important to their community to still have that name be public facing. Another example is Boys and Girls Club West San Gabriel Valley and Boys and Girls Club East Valley came together again a few years ago. And for them, it's more kind of what's going on behind the scenes. So to the world, they're the same organization under West San Gabriel Valley. But because the nature of some of their really complex state contracts, it's going to take time for a merged organization to take over those contracts. So as a step towards a merger, they're set up now as parent subsidiary, where West San Gabriel Valley is the parent and East Valley is the subsidiary. Long term, they plan to have a full merger, but for right now, that's the realistic way for them to come together and gain the benefits of collaboration, but still deal with some of the red tape behind the scenes. So those are just a few examples to give you a flavor of what these restructurings can look like. So now I'm going to toss it back to Allison because we'd actually want to do a poll before we dive in any further.
So this is just kind of a temperature check. You'll see a poll that's showing up in your polling. It may have popped up, but I want to talk a little bit about the elephant in the room, which is, how do you feel about this idea? What's your gut check when we talk about strategic restructurings or mergers and acquisitions? I'm really curious for those of you that decided to chime in today and tune in. How do you feel about the prospect when I say strategic restructure, if I could say it? How would you feel about it? So one is I'm really terrified by the idea. I don't want anything to do with it. Two is I'm somewhat nervous about it. I'm open to it, but it makes me a little uncomfortable. Three is I'm pretty comfortable with it. And four is like, sign me up. I'm super excited. I'm ready to go. So we'll give you a second to vote on that. And feel free also to put your thoughts in the chat. But what we find out really quickly is that we get a lot of, avoidance of eye contact or just some, shaking heads when we talk about strategic restructuring. I think there's a lot of fear around it about the identity of your organization, the legacy of your organization. And so we just wanted to do a real quick gut check on that. Do we have results on that, Rosie? Okay, so this is normal. This is actually pretty optimistic. So one person super terrified by the idea. I get it. It is something totally new, and especially right now, it can feel a little jarring. Somewhat nervous about it. Some of you, may not totally understand it, but we promise that there are ways that you can 100% keep the legacy and the identity of your organization. You're in charge here. So it's really, really good to talk about these kind of hesitations. 14 of you fairly comfortable with it. Excellent. Really would love to talk more about what that looks like and how you're exploring lots of options, because I know that we've gotten some to be part of those conversations. And then I know Carrie has heard even more about it for people that are feeling pretty comfortable about it, maybe don't know where to start. And number 4 is that I'm only in for strategic restructuring. Yay, sign me up, which is exciting. So, Sarah, I know that your board could be terrified, but definitely there's a way to facilitate and open those conversations. And Janet, just a note about the implementation. This is fairly complex. So there's a lot that goes on beyond the partnership talks, things about leases and contracts, more about those things than you would ever want to know. Grant funding requirements and transfer of assets. It is a complex transaction. So I don't want to leave that out or gloss over it while we're going through this. We're not going to dig into it today, but want to acknowledge that, yes, these are very positive transactions. They have outstanding outcomes, but they are pretty complex. So thanks for participating in our panel or in our poll. It's a little hard when we're not interacting face to face, but nice to get a gut check. Okay, I'll throw it back to you. Let's see, I think this is Suzanne. Or no, this is Carrie.
Yeah, so next I think we want to chat a little bit what are the reasons that would maybe motivate you to pursue this process? Because it's not easy. It is time consuming. It is complicated. And so what are some of the benefits? With the NSI, the initiative does not define success based on whether or not organizations end up coming to an agreement, but in the engaging in the process itself. And that is where we find the value. And in fact, we administer a survey to all organizations that receive NSI funding to explore a strategic restructuring agreement. And 100% of our survey respondents who have participated, whether or not their negotiation was completed in an agreement or not, indicate that they found value in the process itself. And I think that that's really important. So you can see here, they report that the strategic restructuring process enhanced measures of board engagement, internal clarity, strategic thinking. Employee engagement is a little bit more complicated, but there is overall a positive impact reported. Industry knowledge, financial awareness of your own organization, fundraising capacity, openness to future partnerships, and external reputation. So you can see here that on so many fronts, organizations are feeling like the time that they invested in the process, even for those that didn't end up resulting in agreement, felt really good about the value that they got out of that experience. And we see that many of them end up coming back to the table with a new partner years later. So I think that actually is the most valuable measure, that they're continuing to use this as a tool, a strategic tool within their leadership toolbox. And I think that that is really the message that we like to share for the initiative, is that we're very process oriented. Is there anything that Suzanne or Allison that you would add on this? Some of the common challenges that we hear from our partners who have gone through the process. This will be no surprise to you, allocating the time. There's a lot of meetings. Allison and Suzanne can probably speak to this in greater detail, but the due diligence process is comprehensive, and so it requires meetings from a lot of stakeholders, board members, executive director, and senior staff a lot of times. So that can be a challenge. Board engagement and availability. It's really important that the board is involved from the beginning, and so that can be a challenge. Communicating the process to staff, navigating staff concerns. This is something that I think a lot of organizations don't anticipate being a challenge, but oftentimes report in hindsight that it was one of the more challenging aspects of deciding when to involve staff, when to inform staff of different decisions, and then address staff concerns and fears associated with a new partnership. So that certainly is something to give some thought to. Navigating power dynamics. This is something that I think having a trusted consultant facilitate the process is so important to address this challenge. Ensuring that there's representation of interests of all organizations at the table, regardless of organizational size, right? So in some cases, you see 2 or more organizations of similar size coming together around a table to discuss the negotiation, but more often there's a variety of sizes, right? And especially with the parent subsidiary model, if that's your goal, oftentimes you're seeing a larger organization at the table with a smaller one. And so I think it's really important, particularly if we're thinking about organizations with different cultural competencies, navigating some of those dynamics. It's really important to have a skilled facilitator to help you navigate that. And then lastly, the cultural integration, the change management, and this I think will come as no surprise to anybody that this oftentimes can be the most long-lasting aspect of the process. So long after the formal agreement is made, it does take investment in integrating organizations, ensuring that those partnerships continue to maintain trust, and that you're integrating the different cultural organization cultures as you go. Is there anything you guys would add to these?
You know, I think the board engagement, the hesitation around the board, even if we as executives are ready to really look at it, I think the board also, their literacy around it and their hesitations, I think, is one of the bigger challenges, and then the desire to loop them in on the process without taking too much time. That's just a tough balance. We want to be very thorough, but maybe we don't need to meet 3 times a week. Yeah, I think that's something that's tough to balance through the process.
We have a question from Amy. She said, I think this kind of speaks to common challenges, so that'd be good for us to chat about it a little bit right now. Amy asked, what happens to C-suite position and leadership when organizations merge? How are positions negotiated? And I think we'd probably, Alice and I would classify that as a common challenge and a barrier that we've encountered in some of these negotiations. And Allison, chime in on your thoughts, but I know what we've seen is putting that on the table sooner rather than later more likely leads to good outcomes. So it can't be that, I'm thinking back to the slide we just had with that elephant sitting in the boardroom, it can't be the elephant in the room where you get through due diligence and you're in the final stages of negotiating and haven't figured out who's gonna lead the organization yet. So how exactly that happens is different with each situation, but the important part is having the conversation sooner rather than later in the process.
Exactly. And I think also having negotiation is the key word there. When both organizations are negotiating from a position of strength in the very beginning of the process, this is a negotiation. And one thing I want to talk about just a little bit, because we're using kind of this broad term, strategic restructuring. The terms of the agreement define the structure of the final organization. So as you negotiate through, well, we want to maintain this structure of leadership. We want 1 board, we want 2 boards, we want a fundraising board, we want one to report to the other. As you negotiate through those details, the structure of what the final organization, the legal structure, that emerges, and that's where you get into implementation, and they start to tell you, okay, if you want everybody is going to stay on and we're going to have this other organization, that's really a subsidiary model, and that's how we're going to negotiate it. So just, you know, an analogy I use a lot of times is, you know, when you're buying a house, you're both doing it from a position of strength. Right? You want the house, you're the buyer. You want to sell the house, you're the seller. But nothing is finalized until you both agree. So definitely that kind of hesitation, the elephant in the room about who's going to be in charge. No, this is a negotiation point. Let's get out in front of it and have those discussions early on, because they really do, as Suzanne said, sometimes we kind of tend to stay away from it until the last minute, and that's where we get derailed. So that's a really good point to make. Thanks.
We've covered some of the incentives, some of the benefits of why to explore an agreement. We've covered some of the challenges. And then here are some sort of predictors of success. So based on, we've seen 240 plus organizations in Los Angeles go through this process with NSI support since 2012. And based on what they've shared with us, we believe that these are some of the key success factors. So having the time to devote to the process, again, this goes back to, it is a process, it's time consuming. So being able to commit to it, demonstrated internal clarity regarding what they aim to gain from the process. So organizations have shared that you know, the more that they go into the negotiation with a defined sense of what they hope to get out of the partnership, the more likely they are going to be able to come to an agreement that satisfies those needs. So that internal clarity is really important from the onset. They report having engaged in honest, upfront conversations with partners. So even from the very beginning, having that trust, being candid, being open about what your concerns are, what the challenges might be with your partner is really important, so that you can make space in the negotiation for those conversations. Some amount of positive working experience with one another. We often see that organizations come to the table having already dabbled a little bit in partnership, oftentimes informally, maybe just on a single event, maybe on some programs here and there. Oftentimes there's a little bit of crossover or cross-pollination among their boards. So just having a little bit of a rapport already really helps in terms of establishing that trust. Compatible mixtures, of course, that's a really key success factor. Something we're talking a lot about with organizations is, have they determined that they operationalize equity in the same way? Do they define equity in the same way? So that goes back to organizational values, and are they aligned? Clear understanding of the strategic restructuring process. So that's basically just knowing what you're getting into, which of course is always a good idea. And I think that goes into also informing your board and having them understand what they're committing to as a process. And then lastly, working with a third-party consultant to facilitate the process. And that's something I already mentioned. We find that it is critical to have that neutral third party who can help both organizations or multiple organizations navigate what can be really kind of sticky conversations at times, and having that expertise in the room. They know the process, they know what to make sure to cover in terms of due diligence, and that is just so valuable in terms of predicting success for an agreement. Mm-hmm. Allison and Suzanne, is there anything you guys would add to this list? I mean, of course, this is by no means everything. So you might have seen noted other trends.
Yeah, two things that, I think that you've covered kind of in a broad sense, but really I want to be very specific about it, is an openness to the due diligence process. It's a little uncomfortable. It's like physical, right? And the report is not always that comfortable. So really understanding and going into it with an opportunity to say, hey, look, this is an opportunity to really look at our organization and see, where we are, take a pulse check. That openness to the due diligence process, and not kind of being, I don't want to share this with the other organization. I don't necessarily want my board to know, that can be destructive for the process. So a key success factor is really being, open and knowing the process and knowing that the due diligence is going to take the organization in a new direction, whether or not you decide to move forward. And then again, going along with that, kind of the know thyself, knowing your organization really well. We find that, we rely very heavily on our executives to help us say, look, this is the constituency that's going to be really excited about this. And this is a constituency that we're going to have to tread carefully in the communications, and we're all going to coordinate together to have these discussions. So those are some really big success factors. It's just that openness and due diligence and communications.
We have a question from John. He asked, and I'll direct this to Carrie, are there any statistics about the success rate of nonprofits using a third-party consultant versus doing it solo?
So I'm sure there are in the sector at large. I don't know them off the top of my head because the Nonprofit Sustainability Initiative requires it. Because we know that it is such an important predictor of success, we require that organizations work with a third-party consultant, and we don't dictate who that consultant is. It's up to the organization to identify a consultant that's a good fit for them, but and has experience with strategic restructuring. But that is in part, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but that is in part what our funding goes toward, is to help make that affordable, accessible for organizations to be able to engage that consultant. So 100% of NSI explorations have been with a third party.
Thanks, Carrie. I don't have a statistic on it either. There might be some studies out there, but I'll say from personal experience, when I was a nonprofit COO and I led a merger, we didn't use an outside consultant, and I will confess, it did not go smoothly. It took much longer than it should have. It was also awkward trying to negotiate directly and not having any sort of intermediary. So I've definitely experienced kind of the flip side of it, and I've seen some of the downsides. All right, I think we can go to the next slide, Rosie, and we're going to talk about how do you know if you're ready. So you see the value, you kind of understand the basics. How do you really have a sense of whether your organization should start thinking about strategic restructuring as a possible option? So Rosie, if you can go to the next one. This might be kind of an avenue to consider if. You might want to think about strategic restructuring if. The first is just community needs are increasing beyond what your organization on its own realistically can even hope to meet. And the Nonprofit Finance Fund did some research a couple of years ago, and they found in that survey that 65% of organizations serving low-income communities felt that they couldn't meet the demand for the services. The demand was increasing too rapidly for them to ever meet the demand. And that was a few years ago. I think if we were to ask that question, particularly in the past few months, it would be even higher. So if you feel like you just, like on your own, it's a mountain, it's just, you know, that you're drinking from a fire hose, you're never going to be able to really make the difference you want to make on your own, strategic restructuring could be something to consider. Program delivery is becoming increasingly difficult, or like the rules have changed, there are new restrictions, and it just requires very fast, smart innovation and scale. I'd probably add to that as well. And certainly we've seen this in the past few months. Really all nonprofits have had to be nimble and adapt, and most have had some sort of program delivery change, at least short term. But some of that could become long term. And it might be that it makes more sense in a new program delivery format to be partnering with another organization. There also could be regulatory changes here that might force changes on you that, you know, your organization on its own just can't sustainably adapt to and meet the need. Real changes to your revenue model are another indicator. And, you know, we're not really talking just about like a dip in individual giving, or maybe you have a year where foundation grants aren't as great as they used to be, but like real structural changes, which might look like government funding shifts where, you know, you just see for the foreseeable future, you know, you're not going to be getting the same government funding that you used to get. And for example, and building up private fundraising, you know, is, you know, something that your organization just hasn't done before. And so really realistically being able to build that up to be sustainable doesn't make a lot of sense. You know, perhaps partnering with another organization that does have that strength and you can bring two strong programs together and be financially sustainable might make sense. Regulatory shifts that will just change your operating model. So we see this sometimes in housing where there are regulatory changes. You see it sometimes like with group homes, we've had some changes. Workforce development is another area where sometimes there can be, you know, changes in just the environment that have nothing to do with your organization or the value and impact of your programs, but the world around you and the rules around you have changed. And so you're going to need to kind of really radically change how you operate. That might make sense to think about whether working with one or more other organizations together, you could continue sustainably. Then the last bullet on here, although I think we could probably come up with a lot of other if statements, but executive leadership transition. So this is something we haven't exactly talked about so far today, but it's something we see quite commonly in strategic restructuring explorations. There have been a few studies in recent years that show as many as 60% of nonprofit mergers are in a situation where a CEO is retiring or is expected to retire. Why is that the case? Well, we think it's a couple of reasons. One is, it kind of does take that elephant in the room off the table to some degree. If you don't have two executive directors and trying to negotiate who's going to take over a merged organization, if you're talking about a merger. Also, during executive leadership transition, hopefully your board is really doing some soul searching about what the future of the organization is, what you need to be sustainable, to continue the organization and continue your impact, especially if you're talking about a long-serving CEO. So it opens up the conversation, hopefully, to what are different strategic options as an organization we should think about. Hiring a new executive would be one, but should we look at some sort of restructuring, we think should also be on the table as well. So that is, something to think about if your organization is in that situation. Carrie or Allison, anything you would add to that?
For that, the example that you gave earlier of hillsides and bienvenidos is a great example of that last bullet point. I know Bienvenidos, was anticipating a longtime leader retiring, and they met with, I think, 9 potential partner organizations before deciding to move forward in negotiations with Hillside. So that was really an intentional strategy for them in terms of succession planning.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, Rosie, you can go on to the next one. All right, so you think kind of the time is right, the situation is right, this is a strategic option that, you think you should consider, your organization should consider. How do you just know if you're ready to dive in? What are some ways to kind of check the boxes to set yourself up for success? And certainly those key success factors that Carrie went over a few minutes ago are a starting point. Getting even kind of more granular, having a cohesive organizational vision, we think is important. Mission, of course, is first. We think vision is really important too, to set you up for success, because that takes you beyond your own organization to think about your community, to think about the long-term impact and change you're trying to create. And it kind of will hopefully open up your mind to different ways that that vision can be achieved. So having kind of a solid organization-wide understanding of what your vision is important. Keeping the needs of the community at the center. This is really a big one. Thinking about the greater good of your vision, of advancing your vision, and it's hard. Strategic restructuring almost always, sometimes in really big ways, involves sacrificing some parts of your current organization, whether it's thinking about your name and your brand, or just how you've always done things will often change. So keeping community needs and vision at the center is really imperative. The executive director and board chair being aligned, we could even go so far as to say even better would be the entire board and the executive director aligned. But we know that, before you start these conversations, this is often the chicken or the egg. Who starts the conversation? How does it start? When does it start? So like at a bare minimum, if we're checking boxes here for starting an initial conversation, we'd say an ED and board chair need to be aligned that this is something we want to open the door to and at least think about and start talking about. Having some basic experience with collaboration is also important. You don't necessarily need to have gone through a strategic restructuring before, but just understanding what's involved, the give and take and negotiation and compromise that's involved in collaboration with 2 or more organizations. Those are important kind of muscle memory that your organization hopefully has that will get you just a little bit closer to being ready to consider this. The next bullet is huge. Being able to continue business as usual for at least 6 to 12 months. Allison mentioned this at the very beginning of our discussion today. Strategic restructurings, even in today's environment, really are not set up for organizations that are in imminent crisis. You can, think that, your sustainability is threatened. You can see kind of some writing on the wall for your organization that isn't necessarily all rosy. That's okay, but knowing that the doors are going to shut in a matter of a few months, you're not in a position at that point to be really undertaking a full-blown strategic restructuring exploration. This takes time. It really is process driven, as Carrie said. And so you need to have that runway to fully explore and be planning from that position of strength and exploring from a position of strength. And then the last one is just being ready to have that very transparent process, transparent discussions with board, with staff to some degree, answering really tough questions internally and with a potential partner. So you need to be able to put everything on the table, and you need to be willing, and Allison mentioned this early, to have tough conversations about leadership, about your goals for the future, about what level of control we want to still have over the organization from a governance standpoint going forward. You need to be able to identify your current culture, what's most important about your culture and your values that absolutely must continue. And you need to think too about things like your brand and your name, you know, and be able to talk about what's most important, understand your strengths and weaknesses, but also really be able to have a position and stance on what must continue for your organization and what you're open to changing. So just having that culture of transparency, a board that's able to have tough conversations, all of those things make you more ready to embark on this process. Carrie, Allison, anything you'd add?
No, I thought that was really, comprehensive. And then you really re-hit back on those points about the business as usual and the being ready to answer the tough questions. Again, this is a conversation about strength and sustainability. And so we really want to make sure that you're in the position to argue really strongly for your mission. This is really about how it benefits the community and your participants. And that should be your driver. So it's really hard to negotiate from that position if any of these other are not in step. So, really think about, can I advocate for the best possible outcomes for our participants and our leaders, our community, if any of those things are not in check. So, there's sometimes some pre-groundwork to getting to the place where you're ready to really think and explore what a strategic restructure might look like.
So we have a couple of questions. We have one question that I think maybe we can tackle right now. It's pretty specific. If a fiscally sponsored nonprofit merges with the nonprofit that sponsors it, is it still considered a merger?
So I think it depends on the outcome of the merger, right? Because not all mergers are mergers. Some are acquisitions, subsidiaries, program collaborations. But my bigger answer to that is yes, right? If you're looking at these are legal structures, these are two corporations, they both have bylaws, they both have EIN numbers and 501c3s, then still that regulatory structure is being changed, and yes, it's still considered a merger. And then Sylvia asked a question about how do you find funding for a consultant to guide you through a merger acquisition? Carrie, do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, this actually might be a good segue to our next slide. I think that's what's next on the document, right? Okay, so I'm here to share a little bit more about the NSI, which stands for the Nonprofit Sustainability Initiative funding, which is available for specifically, there's two phases of funding. The first is for supporting the engagement of a consultant. So that to address your question, Sylvia, if you're in Los Angeles County, you are eligible for funding through the NSI, and that's something I'm happy to chat with you offline about. We also have partners around the country, and I can share a link to the website, but it's the Sustained Collaboration Network. And there are 7, maybe 8 now, regional initiatives around the country who are funding this work similar to NSI. And so if you're not in LA County, we can talk about what some of those options are for you as well.
Thanks so much for answering that. So we've gotten past the pre-work. We've gone through the checklist. We've really thought about this and maybe even broached it to our board. So how do we get started? Because with Carrie here, and she'll explain to you a little bit how you really need to have a partner identified. This is kind of the planning to plan stage. So really, the first step to any strategic restructuring, or truly, if you're doing a strategic plan, if you're doing an executive search, any kind of major vision, trajectory, pivot, you really have to understand your current position. And that's more than just understanding your program delivery, but it's understanding the climate that your program delivery is in right now. How has that shifted, right? For right now, if you're an after-school provider, your program delivery model has completely changed in the last 3 months. So understand what your current position is. If you're contract funded, right, the responses from the different contracts have been all over the board. So if you're HUD or DMH or DPSS or DCFS, you're really in a very shifting position. So the first step is really take a good look at where you are right now and identify what those factors are that you have control of and that you don't have control of, and really getting in front of those and being honest about, you know, what your current position is, because these are things that are definitely going to come out through the process, and you want to have those conversations. 2, identify possible partners. And this is something that you can definitely do independently, or you can do with a consultant, which is do a competitive analysis. Take a look at the organizations that are in your field, the collaboratives that are in your field, and understand who the service providers are, and organizations that you may not think of as natural partners, right? So yes, we could be 2 group home providers that have the exact same service, but we could also be ancillary to each other. So let's say that I am an organization that, yes, I provide housing, but I now really want to expand and provide some more supportive services. Who are those competitors and possible partners in the field that are already doing it really well? Something that a lot of consultants, you know, kind of talk about between ourselves is, you know, there are a lot of good programs already in place, and sometimes we feel the need to recreate the wheel. A lot of times there are a lot of organizations who are already doing it really well, and the opportunity to partner is there. So doing a competitive analysis, taking a look at what the market looks like. Just, you know, we always start with GuideStar, but we also start with stakeholder interviews, conversations, ask our funders. There's such a wealth of information about who else is in the field doing this vital work. 3 is initial discussions. So you have to have the partner already before you really start the process. That means that somebody has to open that conversation. And it doesn't have to start with, hey, would you like us to acquire you? Or how about acquiring us, right? These are conversations where, you know what, we're thinking about our long-term vision, we're thinking about our sustainability. You know, what are you thinking when you think about sustainability and your legacy? How are you seeing service delivery change? These can start off as informational, really, interviews where you're touching base and connecting with fellow leaders in your field. It's a great time to do so, by the way. And really having these open conversations about what if, and really being open about, well, what if we join forces to do this program, or are you seeing the same need in the community, or hey, I'm thinking about retiring in a couple of years. You know, what if? What do those partnerships look like? The next step, let's say, you know, Carrie had mentioned that Hillsides had talked to 9 separate partners, and they vetted them, right? And just like some of the mergers that we've been through, they vetted multiple partners. Formalizing that vetting and really saying, this is what we're trying to accomplish. So I'll go back a little bit to that understanding current positions and mapping your priorities. Okay, if we're looking at a partnership, what are the things that we're trying to accomplish? And then vetting your conversations based on those outcomes, right? So then you say, okay, this is the partner that we're looking for. Let's formalize the exploration. And so this is where we start to get really deep into the due diligence and the vision conversations, the strategy and the negotiation. So this is when we say, okay, we're going to sign a letter of intent. I'm only negotiating with you. You're only negotiating with me during this process. You're usually going to execute some kind of non-disclosure agreement to maintain the confidentiality of the agreement and maintain kind of a cone of silence about this. So just a note about formalizing the exploration. A lot of times we have organizations who have come to us who have already started telling the world this is going to happen. That's a little tricky, right? Because now you're under pressure to make it happen. And now people say, well, why didn't you end up moving forward? Or they might have questions about the sustainability of your organization because, like it or not, there's still kind of thoughts that maybe you're negotiating from a position of weakness. So formalizing that exploration, laying out what communications look like, kind of putting a lid on disclosure and ensuring that, you know, we're going to move forward in good faith. An LOI is not we are going to merge, right? It is just formalizing that exploration. And then finding funding and external support. So NSI is, you know, a great resource in terms of finding that funding to help you explore the process. It's not dependent on what the outcome is. They really are there to help you think through the process and move forward. But also, what does that external support look like? So it's not just, you know, the consultant that will help you move through it, but later on in our implementation phase, you start to need public counsel. You start to need attorneys. Sometimes you need third-party CFOs and accountants to help. And external support really does look like much more than just the funding, right? Because we are all funded by something else. So we start to think about, what does that look like for our contracts? What does it look like for our donors? What does it look like for the community? And start to building a plan around what that external support is that you're going to need if a partnership, a strategic restructure, or merger acquisition is going to take place. Really thinking about what are those external pieces and who are those external stakeholders that are going to help you move forward. Any other first steps that I missed? I feel like these are a lot of steps. No? Okay. So just a really quick question. When a small nonprofit is being absorbed by a large organization, what guarantee do they have the new org will honor their commitments to the program culture set in the MOU or contract? So it's a great question. And again, this is something where you have to start from a position of trust. So if you are trusting an organization enough to consider merging or doing an acquisition with them, then first of all, we always assume trust. But second of all, that doesn't mean that then we leave no exit route. So a merger that we had worked on a few years ago was between smaller organizations in the environmental working group. And they had, in that long-term plan, had certain metrics that needed to be met, and a committee that was installed to ensure that those metrics needed to be met. And it was for a 5-year term after the organization, or after the agreement had taken place. And we've built those into a few agreements to help make sure that the intention of the process is kept intact. And so those are things that you can negotiate throughout the process to say, hey, look, for us, it's really important that we hold this gala every year for the next 5 years. Those are things that are written in, and then you write in clauses that say, but if they aren't. So there are no assets that change hands. Nobody is making money off of mergers, but you can still put forth those contractual agreements that honor the intent of the transaction.
Allison, I would just add also, oftentimes with these partnerships, you see that members of the board of the smaller organization join the larger board. And so that's also another measure of accountability. You can have sort of representatives that understand your organization's mission and values, and can have a seat on the new board, the merged board, to be able to steward those interests ongoing.
Right. Exactly. And you see a lot of that in the negotiations and ensuring, you know, we want to make sure we have 4 board members. We want to make sure we have this committee. They want to have this amount of control. So absolutely, it's something that that is negotiated during the process. So I'll throw it back to you, Carrie, to talk a little bit more about the process.
Sure. So I know we're running out of time, so I'll go quickly, but just a little bit about the initiative. It launched in 2012, And the aim was to normalize the act of strategic restructuring by establishing an environment where service providers, funders, consultants all understand and regularly engage in this process, in this activity as an accessible strategy for enhancing impact and sustainability. That normalization aim is really core to what we do. And now we have actually, since this was written, we have a new funder. So 19 foundations are now at the table supporting this work here in LA County. And it's managed by 4 managing funders: the California Community Foundation, Ralph M. Parsons Foundation, the Amundsen Foundation, and UniHealth Foundation. And the funds are all distributed through the California Community Foundation. There's a link there at the bottom if you want to check out more information. And I'll let you explore that on your own time. There's also, for those that are joining us today not from LA County, you can go to the Sustained Collaboration Network website to check out some of the other regional networks, and that's sustainedcollab.org. So in terms of the process, I covered this a little bit earlier. We have 2 types of funding. One is the first phase is negotiation grants to help you hire a consultant to facilitate the negotiation. And the second is integration. So should you come to an agreement, whether it's a merger or some other sustained collaboration model, you can request funding for one-time costs associated with implementing that agreement. So oftentimes that's rebranding or marketing. A lot of times it's IT integration, back-end consolidation. Sometimes it's, if you're co-locating, then you need to break a lease early and there's fees associated with that. So there's a variety of expenses. Oftentimes it's also consulting because you need additional support to walk through those steps of integration. These funds mostly range from $20,000 to $40,000 for each phase. And we also partner with Public Counsel, which has been a wonderful partnership for NSI, and they will field questions from any NSI grantee regarding like the legal needs of their negotiation. And if they need to be connected with pro bono legal counsel, then they can help you with that. So that's also critical support, I think, for the process beyond just the grant funding. And there's a question here: do you think cross-country partnerships can be successful as local ones? We see a lot of that. So you'll see here the statistics. I'm not going to read them. You can read through them. But of the 242 organizations that have gone through the process, not all of them have been LA County based. The lead applicant needs to be LA County based to be eligible for the funding. But oftentimes we see a local affiliate working to restructure their partnership with a national entity. And that's really common. And we see that being very successful. So certainly there's no reason why both organizations need to be local. It really depends on, all the other ways that they align and are compatible. And this is just a quick snapshot so you can understand how your organization maybe fits into the picture. This is the breakdown of organizations that have received NSI funding in the past to engage in strategic restructuring activities. And you'll see here, there's a great variety in terms of program area. Human services includes community development organizations, housing providers, advocacy organizations, legal aid providers. So it's a pretty broad category there. It captures a lot. Great. Any other questions?
I think we got through all of the questions. Well, so we're going to wrap it up. I know we've hit time and appreciate everybody hanging on for a couple extra minutes so we could get through everything, but the questions were so fantastic. I'm glad we were able to answer them throughout. Carrie, thank you so much for joining us. Your insights are just so valuable for all of us, and particularly for organizations considering this process. And to all of you, we're going to send out the PowerPoint as well as some additional resources and links that we've mentioned throughout today's presentation. And then our final teaser is stay tuned, because in the process of putting together this webinar, we realized that there is so much, we get so many questions about strategic restructuring, we can't possibly cover it in just an hour. So we're going to do a part 2 a little later this summer. And today laid the groundwork for kind of the basics of what you need to know. Part 2, we're going to make it a lot more conversational. We're going to bring in some other folks who have been involved in strategic restructuring, some organizations who have walked this path and can share some of their lessons learned. And we're also going to try to get a funder involved as well to talk about from their perspective, what they're looking for and where they see the value. So you'll receive an email from us about scheduling this part 2. And in the meantime, we'll send you these materials, and of course, reach out if you have additional questions. Thank you again, Carrie, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Have a good day.